It's time for Drummer Nation. Bill Goodwin began his professional career at the age of 17 with saxophonist Charles Lloyd. During the 1960s, he worked with Art Pepper, Bud Shank, George Shearing, and many other jazz luminaries. In '69, Bill moved east to work with Gary Burton and settled in the Pocono Mountains. In '74, he became a founding member of the Phil Woods Quartet and remained with Woods for some 40 years as a drummer and record producer, and winning 3 Grammys along the way. Bill Goodwin, welcome to Drummer Nation, and thank you for doing my show.
Great to be here, Michael.
I really appreciate it. I've been a fan of yours for a long time, and I've heard you play live and, of course, on a lot of records. I heard you with Phil Woods to a place in Atlanta called EJ's in the, 70s?
EJ's, yeah, Steve Negri.
Yep.
Is the owner, and I still occasionally hear from Steve. I don't know where he is, but he's not in Atlanta anymore, I don't think.
No, he's not. Well, I'd like to just turn this into a couple of guys talking about drums pretty quickly, but do a little background on you. I was surprised to see, I've been reading a little bit about you, that you were almost completely self-taught.
Well, I took music lessons from the time I was a young kid. I took piano lessons for maybe 5 years old to 10 years old, weekly piano lessons. And then I got interested in the tenor sax. So I had a saxophone teacher from about 10 till 13.
Okay.
And, during that time, around 12, I started getting really interested in drum. Well, I mean, I loved listening to jazz, and I loved certain drummers, and then I kind of, a neighbor, a good friend of mine, had a snare drum, and I think I borrowed it until his mother made me give it back, and then developed this interest, and eventually got my mom to get me, some used drums, and then I guess the rest is history. It just kind of developed naturally, but I didn't study formally at all until later on. I was already working as a professional musician from the time I was 17.
I want to ask you about that, but that makes more sense to me as how you became such a wonderful player, could read and teach and all that stuff had you been completely self-taught. But you were a musician before you were a drummer musician.
Well, I was raised in a very musically aware family, and my father was an actor, and he loved, and a jazz lover. My mom was a professional dancer. And so she really knew about rhythm, and they both were very musically astute. And we had a huge record collection. It was always being updated. It was literally everything from bunk to monk.
I like that.
And I had started collecting my own records, and I started getting into West Coast jazz. And I think the folks were saying, well, you think maybe, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie are more advanced than those guys. But, as a 12-year-old kid, I wasn't, I was very much a know-it-all. So I would argue with my parents about the relative merits of Charlie Parker and Dave Brubeck. But they turned out to be right. Nothing against Dave. I love Dave. But
right. Well, there's a Mark Twain quote that says, I'll paraphrase it. When I was 18, I thought my father was the stupidest man in the world. And when I was 21, I couldn't believe how much he had learned in 3 short years.
Exactly.
Now, your first gig at 17, you were playing with Charles Lloyd, right?
Yeah, I met some funny thing, interesting fortuitous things have happened in my life. And one is that I have an older sister, Jill, who always loved music and loved musicians and always dated musicians and married 2 of them. And her first husband was a guy named Terry Trotter, who's a wonderful piano player in Los Angeles, who's best known as an accompanist. That he worked with Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet, Frank Sinatra. He worked with Natalie Cole for many years, and he's a fantastic musician. He's a year older than me. So I was 17 or 16, Terry was 17, and his best friends were Bobby Hutcherson and Herbie Lewis. So he introduced me to Bobby and Herbie, and we started playing together, and then he introduced me to Charles, who was a student at USC, only maybe a year or 2 older than me at that point, but he seemed more mature. He was a college student, and he was already married, he had a car, and he had a weekend gig at a coffee house in Pasadena, California. So we started going there to hang out and to jam, and I ended up jamming, and he eventually hired me, and I worked with the band for about 6 months. I was 17.
Hang on one second. I forgot to turn these other little lights on. It won't matter. I'll just go to you through that part. I got several camera angles. All right. Well, let me pick back up.
So that's how I met Charles. Just as a sidebar, then my sister's second husband was Phil Woods.
Oh, okay.
Which is how I met Phil Woods. My sister brought him over. I didn't even have to leave my house.
And that was a long-lasting relationship. We'll get to that in a minute. But you were living on the West Coast because
Los Angeles.
Okay, because I know Charles Lloyd was associated with Ornette, Chico Hamilton, Charlie Hayden, that group of West Coast guys.
You know, when I met Charles, he was a student at USC.
Mm-hmm.
He was from Memphis, Tennessee, and he was a very, very intelligent, very sophisticated musician for his age, I guess for any age. And then he got out of school and he got the gig with Chico. Chico's band was based in Los Angeles, and he had always had the cello, saxophone, flute, doubler, guitar, bass, and drums band.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he hired Charles, and Charles was in a version of that band, and then he talked Chico. He was always very aggressive at trying to do the things that he wanted to do. He transformed Chico's band into a hard bop quintet with tenor and trombone and guitar, bass, and drums. He basically hired everybody new in the band and basically took over the band.
Let's talk about that for a second. How would you characterize? Let's talk about that for a second. How would you characterize the difference between the bop, hard bop, the New York versus the LA sound at that time?
Well, there's really no difference. There was a commercial considerations, of East Coast, West Coast jazz. It's sort of like a tennis match or, some kind of a, context, context. Really all the famous West Coast jazz musicians were mostly from New York.
Exactly.
The guys I associated with the East Coast were from LA, like Zoot Sims and Jimmy Knepper and people like that. So it was pretty much of an interchange. The thing about West Coast jazz was very, very concerned with guys on big bands, particularly Stan Kenton, I think. Kenton was based in L.A., and the guys would be on his band. And you look at the personnel of his bands in the 50s, and it's like, Bob Cooper and Bud Shank and Art Pepper and Frank Rossellino and Conte Candoli and Shelley Mann and Stan Levy and, they're all guys who settled on the West Coast after they got off the road. Those are the musicians that Shorty Rogers, the guys that I admired when I was, becoming an avid jazz listener and then trying to play.
That was my introduction to jazz music as well. My dad was a Shorty Rogers fan, a Kenton fan. Took me to hear the Kenton band when I was a kid, and the rest was I was blown away by all that stuff, and I still love all that stuff.
I do. Yeah, I loved Woody's band. I always loved the big bands. I loved Woody's band, and I was of course a big fan of Benny Goodman's band and Artie Shaw's band. And we had all those records when I was a kid, so I was hearing the music, all the time. As soon as my folks realized that I had an interest in music, they started taking me out to hear live music.
Now, Shelley was a big influence on you back then, right?
Yeah, he was. He was my main influence when I first decided I wanted to play seriously. I had heard him on the soundtrack of the Man with the Golden Arm movie, and he was featured on that, and that was Shorty and all the West Coast guys.
All those guys you just mentioned, yeah.
I'd gone to see the movie with my mom and my sisters, and I'd heard him doing the hi-hat beat, basically, and it kind of blew my mind. And I think I decided at that point, I was about 12, that I was going to be a drummer. Somehow it just seemed very logical that I knew how to do that. I had never really played a drum set, but I knew, I'd watched people play, and I knew how you made that sound. So it was an easy jump kind of in my 12-year-old mind to, spending a life in music, going on the road, and playing with all the greatest musicians in the world. So,
As you have, as you have.
how it works out.
How would you characterize the hallmarks of your style that you learned from listening to Shelley and his contemporaries?
Well, I was also listening a lot to anybody who crossed my path on the West Coast, and then I was soaking up everything and stealing everything I could from every drummer that I heard.
Well, let's talk about the ride cymbal, for example.
Oh, the ride cymbal. Oh, I don't know. I think when I was about 16, I met and was befriended by Billy Higgins, who was a little older than me, but he was already playing and recording in Los Angeles, and we met at a jam session, and we became acquainted, and we became friends. We were good friends over the years. I hadn't really thought about it, but he turned me on to Kenny Clark, and he especially. I had mentioned that I really liked his cymbal beat, Billy's cymbal beat. He said, "Well, I'm just copying Kenny Clark. That's my man, and you should check him out." And I always liked that kind of cymbal beat, and I liked the New Orleans guys. I always loved, and Earl Palmer was also in Los Angeles at that time, and I would hear him play.
Let's dig into that cymbal.
A really good beat.
I'm sorry, there's a delay. It's hard to. I don't mean to talk over you. Let's talk about that cymbal beat. You can listen to great jazz drummers and pretty much identify them a lot of times by their cymbal beat. What can you tell me about your approach to that?
Well, my approach is to play a solid quarter note and play a full. People talk about the big beat. Well, the big beat starts before it starts and finishes after it ends. It's like the breath, the breath, it's not 1, 2, 3, it's a 1, a 2, a 3, the breathing in, the breathing out. And I really got the insight, my largest insight to that came from when I was lucky enough to work for a couple of years with the great bass player, Leroy Vinegar. And we had become friends and neighbors, and then I started playing in his group. And I would just kind of try to play with him because he had such a beautiful beat, and I had been playing along with records. He was on the Shelley Man records, and he was on a lot of my favorite West Coast jazz records. So I learned a lot from the bass players, but particularly Leroy, and of course I was listening to the bass drum combination. I really liked Paul Chambers and Philly Joe Jones, and I liked Kenny Clark and Paul Chambers, and I like Percy Heath and Kenny Clark, and I like Connie Kay and Percy Heath, and I love George DeVivier and Connie Kay, and I was looking for that. It's kind of an ineffable thing, but always looking for what sounded good with bass and drums. It's not just about the drums; it's also about how they interact with the bass, and then what happens in the rhythm section. I guess I likened it to, kind of trying to play from the bottom up rather than from the top down, if that makes sense.
When you talk about it ending after the beat, you're thinking more like legato, like longer notes?
It's long, it's not tink, tinky, tink, tinky, tink. It's da, 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 da. So another really important drummer on the West Coast is little talked about these days, but his name was Frank Butler. And he was a supreme, fantastic artist, great soloist, great creative drummer, fantastic beat. And he and like Leroy Vinegar together, for example, was just the most exquisite, one of the greatest, bass drum teams ever for me.
When you talk about the bottom up, do you ever feather the bass drum for quarter notes?
Yeah, I play the bass drum. Absolutely. And even if I'm not playing it, it's in there. I don't really believe in that. I know the term is the feathering is understandable, kind of jargon for drummers, but I don't think of it that way. I think of it as you play softer, you play louder. I play with dynamics. It depends on the musical situation, but I don't muffle my bass drum, and I use a fairly soft beater, and I just try to mix it in with the sound.
Use an 18, basically?
Well, right now I mostly use 18. I have an 18, I have a 16, The one I like the best that I'm playing now is my old Slingerland 20 by 12.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, isn't that the same amount of air as a
14
18
by
by 14?
Yeah. Well, dimensionally it is, but the way it projects is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that's subjective, And I'm behind the drums, It's hard to say what it sounds like in front, but I kind of I think I was influenced by the availability of that size. One of the first drum sets I bought myself was a 22 by 12, and it was one of Stan Levy's drum sets that he was selling when he got a new drum set from Ludwig. I bought two of those. I bought a 22 set with bigger tom-toms from Stan, and then I bought a set with a smaller bass, 20 by 12, and the smaller tom-toms from Stan.
Now, you've worked with a lot of disparate artists. Do you generally have your sound that you bring in, or do you use different drums for different settings?
Well, I've always tried to do it all with one drum set, but of course, as you know, in the recent days, playing, I stopped touring with drums like 20 years ago when I really don't tour much at all anymore. And now if I tour, I usually don't even take cymbals. I take sticks and brushes, mallets. I just like, give me whatever you got. I figure I got this. I know what I sound like. I'm going to be me. It was just led to some pretty funny, playing on some pretty funny stuff sometimes. But mostly, I don't know. I've never found one stick that I really like. I've never found, any particular things that I have to have. I have certain ideas about tuning and projection of the sound, and I try to, keep those in mind.
I think the sound is in the artist more than the gear. I mean, I used to be in the gear business, had a cymbal company, but I still think the sound comes from the person.
Well, when I was very young, pretty young, I was already playing professionally, but I went to see one of my all-time favorite drummers and meet him for the first time, and that was Roy Haynes. And Roy was playing at Shelley Man's Club, which is a wonderful club in Hollywood, Shelley's Manhole. Mm-hmm. And after the set, I went up and introduced myself, and Roy was very nice and affable. And I said, "Gee, Roy, it's so great to meet you, and you're, one of my favorite drummers, blah, blah, blah. And what kind of drums do you like?" I knew that it was a jive question because I knew he played Slingerland drums. But, I read Downbeat and I saw the ads. So he points to the drums, and I think it was a set of Slingerland drums. He says, "I've just met you and you're a young guy, but that's, I'm not going to give you a hard time, but that's a really stupid question. Look at this drum set. Does it look any different than any other drum set?" I said, "No, it looks just like," he said, "they're all the same, man. The sound is in you."
Beautiful.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have those recordings of like Tony Williams in Europe where he's playing Paistes, which
Sure.
are probably the genetic opposite of old K's, and he still sounds like Tony, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I had a friend in the 60s who was convinced that he could just get a hold of Tony's K, that it would change his life, And I said, I'm sorry to tell you, man, but it's not going to make you sound like him. And, why would you want to sound like him anyway? And,
Right.
sound like somebody else. I mean, Tony imitated Roy and, Max and Art, and he copied from everybody. Cop from everybody to make up our own, what do we like,
Now, let me ask you about volume. I remember hearing you play, and especially with Phil Woods' group, you guys prided yourself on the fact that you didn't really need to mic it and EQ it and run it through a bunch of stuff. I mean, the band sounded mixed and balanced on the bandstand.
Well, that evolved from when we started touring. We played in small clubs. They'd want to put up sound, and we go like, "Well, we don't." Do you ever hear Phil Woods live? I mean, you could hear him like 4 blocks away, man.
He had a big sound.
Loud. And if you have good instruments and you listen to each other, you can balance and you can play at all different volumes. But the concert hall, we started playing concert halls, and that would be, they'd be wanting to mic up everything in the concert hall. You're playing in Carnegie Hall. It's one of the greatest acoustic spaces in the world. We just say, take the mics away. So we would use, we just get close together and balance ourselves, in the thing. That when everybody in that band decided they wanted to do that, we had a kind of a family band concept. We discussed a lot of things together. We kind of ran it like a cooperative. And we say, well, we've decided we want to play without microphones. And they all looked at me like, well, what are you going to do? Oh, I guess I'll, play softer, or, I'll try to, blend. But I'd always been into that anyway. And I was, of course, a big fan of the Modern Jazz Quartet. And I heard them many times in concert. And they didn't really do it. They would a little mic in front of the bass, maybe something on the vibes. But they never like a mic on Connie Kate bass drum or anything. And you could hear them. You're in the back of the room,
Wasn't that Benny Goodman live at Carnegie Hall in 1939? Sure. One mic hanging over the band?
Yeah, one mic.
Yeah, sounds great. That
recording wasn't even a professional recording. That was Albert Marks recorded that on discs because he was married to the singer, this was Helen Forrest. And Albert Marks, who later started a label, forget what it was called. We used to call her, he paid so little money, he called him the other Marx brother, Cheapo Marx. But he was a good guy, and he had the foresight to record that, and he gave the disc to Benny, a copy to Benny, and Benny kind of put him on a shelf, and then John Hammond or somebody who was Benny's brother-in-law came across him and said, "What are these?" And listened to him and like, "You got to put these out." And there you have it. One of the great, concert recordings of all time.
Especially that version of "Sing, Sing, Sing."
Yeah, well, Gene was sensational. What a great player, and what an icon. An icon. To all drummers, he created like the desire for like drum solos. Kind of people used to solo a little bit, but it wasn't. I wasn't alive till 42, but. I was very aware of, his contribution. And then later on, I never really met Gene, but I got to know Buddy Rich quite well. And he always spoke of Gene with the greatest love and respect, and said that very thing. So I'm really just parroting what Buddy said.
Don't you, when you hear young drummers today, I think the problem drummers have with doing what you're talking about, playing to balance the band, is that it's hard to play that soft with that kind of intensity, especially at the tempos you're required to play. Don't you hear a lot of young kids that are just beating their brains out?
Well, I do teach, so yes.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
But it's not, it's not the volume. It's, as you mentioned, it's the intensity that's important. It's your placement, it's your intensity, and it's also your projection. So a lot of the young drummers I know, they like the really, really dark cymbals, and they tune their drums. They tune their drums as all the same way, and they have these really dark cymbals, and you get about 10 feet from them, and you can't hear the cymbal beat. And so, I use cymbals that maybe they don't sound that great to me from behind the drums, but they sound great about, the back of the room. Said, I look for the projection. I'm listening for... if I'm at Carnegie Hall and I'm hitting the drums, I'm listening for the slap back from the back, from the wall, the back of the hall. And then I'm judging my sound, but it's like, putting myself in two places at once, in a way.
Now, if I were 21 years old and studying from you, what would my course of study look like?
It would be a lot of listening, and it would be a lot of rudimental studies, just getting the hands together, and then a certain amount of basic four-way coordination. I was privy to the original Dahlgren and Fine books. I knew those guys, and they showed me their first book when it was still in galleys. And I said, "Wow, that's really interesting." I said, "Yeah, we're just like writing down all this stuff that the guys like you and Roy and Elvin and Tony are doing." And they wrote, they made exercises out of them. And I go for a very basic approach. If you look at the rudiment sheet, it's basically comprised of single strokes and double strokes. And many things can be. I got a pad here. I'll try to show it, though. It won't be. I don't know if you can really see it or not.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so roughs, right?
Right.
Turns into a triple stroke roll. double stroke roll, Swiss triplet,
Right.
and so forth. So I'll point out to the student, okay, so I'm going to recommend that you get Ted Reed. I'll recommend George Lawrence Stone, and then if you want to get into Chapin, and I like the Henry Adler book, the Buddy Rich drum method. Because they have the pictures of Buddy Rich's hands.
Yeah.
It's a guy who never had a lesson, but had the perfect grip and the perfect approach to playing the drums.
Freak of nature.
I'm an atheist, man, but that's Stan Levy used to say that's God's gift to the drums. That guy.
Yeah. Nobody can explain that.
I can't object to that term at all, but it all comes from. For me, for the students, going to get from me like an interest in pursuing how things work. So I'll have them transcribe, find things that they like, and I'll have them transcribe the things that they like and play them for me, and then I'll have them create their own things. I have a couple of students they're really, really creative in finding like very odd ways of playing time signatures and superimposing things onto other time signatures. And I'll, encourage them in that, and then I'll try to get them to, to think about what they're going to be doing with it practically. And start to, amassing your phone book and your network, and meet a lot of other drummers and leaders of bands that you might want to play with, and just start like digesting music.
Mm-hmm.
I learned every working jazz band, I'd memorize their repertoire. I had all the records. I memorized everything that Miles was playing, everything Cannonball was playing, everything Monk was playing, everything Mingus was playing, Oscar Peterson Trio, Modern Jazz Quartet. Whoever had a gig, you never know, right?
Right.
You'd be sitting in a club, and all of a sudden Connie Kay has indigestion, and somebody said, "Anybody in the place that can play the drums and knows this music?" And I would go, "I do."
Isn't that how Danny Richmond got the Mingus gig?
I prepared for that, and I actually did get to sub for later after Mingus was gone. I subbed for Danny Richmond one night in Germany because he had left to go to London to do something, and he didn't get back in time for the gig. So I played the Mingus music with it was the Mingus Dynasty band of that time. So I subbed for Danny, who had become quite a good friend. We toured together, with that group and Phil's group.
But I heard he was in a club, and Mingus said, "Is there a drummer out there who can play fast?" or something to that effect.
Well, something like that.
Danny was like, "Yeah, okay, I'll try."
Well, Danny was a saxophone player, and either that or a friend of his went to Mingus and said, "That drummer you got is okay, but my friend plays much better than him, and he's not even a drummer." So Mingus was intrigued. And he played with Danny when, he fired the other guy and hired Danny.
Some story about the serendipity of it, as you were referring to.
Story out of Danny Richmond. I mean, he was a fabulist, a great guy.
Well, you mentioned these guys that you've went to school on. Let me mention a few of the people you've worked with and get some response from you, maybe as what you've learned from them or with whatever comes to mind. Bill Evans?
Well, Bill Evans and I we were personally acquainted for many, many years, well over a decade. We were friendly, through my friendships with some of his friends and musicians that worked with him. I guess I'd have to mention Chuck Israels, who was a big supporter of mine from the beginning, and hired me and recommended me for many, many jobs. But I had met Bill and hung out with him, and we socialized. And then when I had become very good friends with Marty Morell, who was the drummer for many years, and Marty, they come to L.A. or I'd go to New York. Marty and I we'd hang out, and we would go out for lunch, and he would come over to my house. And he was a good piano player as well, so we would play. We'd play like piano and drum duets. And when Marty left the trio, Bill's manager, Helen Keene, called me up and said, Bill's going to be auditioning drummers, but he told me to call you first. He says, everybody's been people were telling both of us that we should be playing together for 10 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
People like Chuck and other people too. So I got the call, and I went out and played with them for about 10 days. We went out to Chicago, basically, and played with Eddie Gomez on bass. And we didn't rehearse or anything, and it was funny because you know Bill a really long time, and I heard him play a zillion times. And we had played together in, I think we had played together in maybe in Chuck's big band, the National Jazz Ensemble. We had Bill for a guest artist on a concert, so we had played there. But I hadn't played in the trio officially. So I went out and played in the trio, and Bill said, well, we don't need to rehearse because, you know all my stuff, right? I said, oh, yeah, I know all your stuff. I didn't know the name of one tune except it was My Romance and Nardis, the only two tunes that I recognized. He was playing all different tunes. I had to ask him what the titles were, at the end of the gig. He says, I thought you knew that stuff. I said, not really, but, I can hear something one time and I memorize it. So I'm very good that way.
Marty Morell told me they never rehearsed, they never talked about the music.
No,
they just
really
played
talk
it.
about music. You talk about, we'd hang out every night and we'd talk about the news, talk about TV shows, comic books, people that we knew, tell jokes.
Mm-hmm.
Thing.
When I came up, I thought all the guys who were playing that highly interactive style of the mid-'60s and further that had evolved from a more supportive role must have gotten together and talked about it, They must have worked it out. But the people I've spoken with who were there, we just played.
Well, I think if you look at the role of the drums, it evolved. People give Miles's group and Tony and Ron and Herbie a lot of credit for those advances, but that was happening for years before those guys played together.
Well,
and
Bill Evans especially.
Certainly involved with that, but Tony was only 16 when he joined Miles, so he couldn't have been involved for that long.
Right.
And
that did you gravitated towards that way back, or did you just let the music decide?
I was all over that from the beginning.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
But I wanted to be a working musician. You were going to be like, I was avoiding listening to Elvin Jones too much because that was such a powerful. It seemed like that influence was just like pulling you into that orbit, But he was all about Max Roach. I mean, he would say that he told Billy Hart, he says, if I could tell you anything about drumming, I would be all about Max Roach. So I see Max Roach as being instrumental in that, more than anyone else, being the most instrumental guy in what I would call the new music. Started with bebop, and he was playing across the bar line. He was playing interactively. By the mid-'50s, the records he was making, he was playing on the drums as much as he was playing on the cymbal. He wasn't playing in normal. He was playing melodically as a full part of the band.
Comprehensive musical choruses.
Exactly. But I mean, in the accompaniment as well.
Right.
He'd come off of the ride and play on the drums. And then later you'd hear that influence in a drummer like Eddie Blackwell, with Ornette Coleman. He was very Max Roach oriented and just took it to another, take it to another dimension. Not another level, really, because Max played at the highest level, and so did Eddie.
Right. How about Dexter Gordon?
Well, I met Dexter when I was about 18, and he was, of course, one of our, I had loved him on record for years, and then I met him, through, my aforementioned friends like Bobby Hutcherson and Herbie Lewis, and the L.A. scene. I mean, I would go to see Dexter play. He did a regular Monday night jam session at the Hotel Watkins in Los Angeles. And the drummer led the session. It was a guy named Kenny Dennis. Kenny Dennis was from Philadelphia. He had been the relief drummer in Miles Davis's band. He played a lot like Philly Joe Johns. And he was married to Nancy Wilson, the singer. They moved to Los Angeles. And he had a regular Monday night gig at this hotel. And it was a jam session with Kenny and a bass player and a good piano player. And Dexter would be like the guest star. It's every Monday for about a year. And so I would go down and hear them play, and you could get on get on the list to sit in. So I was there one night, and my turn came up, and I got up and played, and it was 1960. I was 18, and I was, trying to get myself together. I had a good tune, and I could see, Dexter liked it. He was very nice and complimentary. But he was super supportive to all the young musicians.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, later on, when he made his big comeback, in New York and all that, I would go see him, and we would spend, at times hours just sitting and talking about, it was like the old days, in L.A. And I was friends with a lot of the guys that he was in jail with.
Right.
I was friends with those guys. And, like Art Pepper, for example.
Right.
Another of the older guys that took an interest in me when I was younger, and then later hired me when I was sufficiently, able to play with them. I never worked with Dexter. I knew him well, and we were friends. I only played with him that one time.
Oh, really?
But he would always tell people, say nice things about me. And, we toured together also later on with Phil's group. We did a lot of work together.
You mentioned Nancy Wilson. You've worked with some singers, too. You worked with June Christie, Joe Williams.
Yeah, Anita O'Day.
Uh-huh.
Just in L.A., Ruth Brown. Oh, man, Lorez Alexandria.
So that's a whole different band.
Bill Williams. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of work, playing with singers, and I wanted to work.
Right. But you have to make some changes, right? That's not like working with Bill Evans.
Well, you're not going to go full Elvin on June Christie, Well, I'm a good accompanist. I have good musical skills, and I have desire to make a living. And so I would say I always loved jazz the most, and I always wanted to play jazz, and I've been lucky enough in the bulk of my career to be basically making a very good living playing jazz.
Mm-hmm. And you
but
did work
a lot of other stuff, man. I had a lot of commercial work, a lot of shows. I did like pit work. I played with the Alvin Ailey Ballet.
Mm-hmm. You worked with Steely Dan, right?
I never worked with Steely Dan. I don't know how that ever got.
It's in your bio somewhere. Yeah, I thought that was an outlier.
I never did.
Okay.
Peter Erskine did.
Oh yeah.
I never worked with them, but I knew those guys, and I got Donald Fagen to write some liner notes for a Phil Woods record one time.
Oh, okay. So let's talk about the Poconos. You were one of the first guys to. That's kind of an enclave for jazz musicians, right?
Yeah, but I wasn't one of the first guys. The first guys were the bass player Buddy Jones, and was a studio and jazz bass player. Jazz player became like a working studio guy and radio and jingles and stuff in L.A. and and then Irby Green, the trombonist, and then my good friend and fabulous vocalist and songwriter and producer Bob DeRoe.
Oh yeah.
Bob invited me to visit him in the Poconos in 1969. I just moved to New York from Los Angeles to join Gary Burton's quartet. And I got back in touch with Bob. We had worked together in Los Angeles with the folk singer Chad Mitchell. And we had just become friends. I became friends with Bob like almost immediately, when I met Bob. We had a lot of mutual friends. And over the years, before I met him, people would say, oh, you got to meet Bob DeRoe. You guys will get along great. And he called me to work with him, in Los Angeles. And with this folk singer, with Chad Mitchell at the Troubadour. And we literally became friends like within a day or two. And he just died a couple of years ago, and but he's like one of my best friends ever. Friend for life. Great guy, great talent, great musician, and a great person. He invited me to visit him in the Poconos. I came out, and having moved from Los Angeles to New York City. And I had a wife and a kid. It wasn't, we had a house in L.A. Now we're living in like a fifth floor walk up in the East Village, subletting and looking for a place to live. We come out to the country to visit Bob, and it's like, wow, it's really nice out here. Not that far away,
How far away is it from New York?
It's 70 miles.
Yeah, see that. So that, no wonder. It was beautiful. It was in the mountains. It was totally different than urban struggle in New York City. And who were some of the other jazz musicians who moved there?
When I moved out, it was Bob and Herbie, Buddy Jones, Russ Savakis, who was a bass player who had been with the Claude Thornhill band in the 40s and 50s, and he became a recording bass player and contractor. He was my neighbor. He immediately, and Bob too, they both started hiring me for like commercial work in New York. I was doing jingles. I did a great deal of the Schoolhouse Rock series with Bob, maybe 80%. It's either me or Bernard Purdy or Grady Tate. It was mostly me. And Russ, who was like contracted and played bass for Burt Bacharach. And so he was the bass player on all the Burt Bacharach records with Gary Chester on drums. They were like a team. You hear all that great Burt Bacharach, Dionne Warwick, all those records from the 60s. That's Russ Savakis on bass.
I didn't know that was Chester. That was Gary Chester. That was Gary Chester, right?
Drummer on the Burt Bacharach records.
No, I didn't know that.
Gary was like the first, one of the first call guys in New York. Say he was like the Hal Blaine of New York, at that time. And the other guys were busy, but Purdy was just really starting to get going. Grady Tate was just kind of starting to get going, in the late 60s. Bill Livornia was very busy, Gary Chester. And then some of the younger guys came along. There was a drummer named Donald McDonald who was, before me and before Steve Gadd, who was just great and was playing everything from commercial, stuff to playing jazz, and was a great jazz player. And early jazz rocker that was starting to go on, and they're finding, guys like me and Donald and Alan Schwartzberg, Marty Morell. I know I'm leaving people. Steve Schaefer.
Right. Let's talk about. I'm sorry.
Denny Sywell.
Oh, right. Let's talk about your producing. You have a long career as a producer as well. What led you to put that hat on?
Well, that happened when I was doing a record date, and the producer was in the booth talking on the phone, and I knew the guy, and I knew he was not musically knowledgeable, and he was talking on the phone. He wasn't listening to music at all, and I realized that I was making $100, and he's probably making $1,000. I was thinking to myself, I could do that job. I could certainly do better than this guy who was a total pill, and didn't know anything. And then he would come out and try to tell you how to play. And it was, so it was sort of like a revenge thing.
What is the role of a producer?
I've been paying attention to, I had worked, at that point worked with, so this is in the 70s, mid-70s, and I had worked with a lot of producers at that point, a lot of name producers. And some of them were great, and all of them were, in one way or another, good to work with, because after all, you were working. And if they liked you, they'd call you back. So, I wasn't trying to, start anything. I was just doing the job. But I thought to myself, I think I could do that job. And then I got an opportunity to do it because of my association with Phil and with the quartet. We found ourselves without a producer, without a manager, and without a label. And I had been just recording the band on some live dates, using my own money. It didn't cost that much. And I'd been fooling around in the studios in New York with friends who were musicians and engineers, and we'd get studio time late at night, and it was all, just the scene. You'd go in and try out some music and be recorded, and so I realized that I knew what good mics looked like, and I knew how the process worked. And I had started recording, I was very young in Los Angeles. I had first experiences of recording when I was still in my teens. So I had a clue, though I wasn't an engineering type. I wasn't really interested in that. I was interested in the process, and I knew how it worked. I was interested in the music and what makes a good sounding record. So
what makes a good producer?
Find out by working with a great band, and then recording that band, and of course, and I was in that band,
Mm-hmm.
and then had the experience of taking those under the aegis of the quartet, to sell them. I had like 2 LPs worth of material that I had recorded myself, and it cost me, roughly a couple $100 to do the recordings,
Mm-hmm.
and I went and sold them for thousands of dollars. So right away, the guys in the group thought, "Wow, Bill really knows what he's doing." So, very one of those fortuitous circumstances I was talking about before.
Well, I think producing is sort of shrouded in mystery to most people. What you mentioned, you knew the gig sort of. What is it that a producer does?
Well, that's a good question. It could be anything and everything. In my case, it was everything from supervising the session to hiring the musicians, supervising the session, supervising the mixing, and making sure everybody got paid, and then even taking the product and taking it to a label and getting them to buy it. I learned how to negotiate the studio, but I'd been in the recording studio numerous times.
Mm-hmm.
At that point. I was no stranger to the studio. I knew a lot of musicians, I knew a lot of engineers, I knew a lot of studios, and I had good relationships with people in the industry. I had met people who worked in record companies, and that started when I was a teenager, going to hang out at Contemporary Records with Lester Koenig, because of my friendship with Art Pepper. I could just walk in to Contemporary, and if somebody was recording, he'd take me back to see, what was going on. I attended record dates, and I did record dates, and then I, just seemed to fall into producing. And I had the opportunity to produce one of the best, and at that time, one of the hottest, jazz bands in the country, or maybe
Sure.
the world, which was Phil's.
And I hope people understand there's a little bit of delay. I never mean to talk over you. You won a Grammy as a producer, right?
I won 3 actually as a member of not as a producer, but as a member of the group. But I was involved in 3 Grammy-winning records, which were all for best jazz group. But as a producer, you get a plaque or a scroll, but you don't get the Grammy. I mean, I'm not T-Bone Burnett or Larry Klein or Don Was or not, but. I mean, I admire those guys, and I have the Grammy thing for Phil's group. We were really hot. We were getting nominated every year there for a while. Before us, it was Bill Evans, and then it was us, and then it was Wynton, and it's probably still Wynton. I don't know.
I don't know. A few things about Phil. First of all, my condolences on the loss of your dear friend. It's been a few years back now.
Yeah, it's been almost 4 years now. Yeah.
Yeah. But you guys were together for how long?
40 years.
That's
He
great.
was married to my sister.
Right.
She ended up getting married.
But that's not why you had the gig that long.
I don't think so. I mean, he was able to fire me at any time.
Yeah.
The group was set up. Any of us could fire each other at any time. It was a real I mean, he was my brother-in-law, but the band was really set up like a band of brothers.
Oh, that's terrific. Let me ask you to comment on this wonderful quote. I know people have asked you about it before, from Phil Woods. Bill is the magic ingredient in our all-acoustic group. He's one of the masters who plays the song, not just the time. He shades and tints beautifully. He plays the music.
Yeah, it was nice. That's on. It's been on his website for years. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I would say that represents my aims in as a musician, as a drummer. So always be in touch with the material, and as a producer, I mean, I think the program is the most important thing. I'm not. I mean, I like the idea of autophilia, if that's a word. The audio, and I've done audiophile recordings, and been involved in that, as a player and as a producer. But that's not the primary thing. The primary thing is the music, and trying to bring it, to the audience, and trying to put the audience in the best seat in the house. That's the hallmark of my style, if there is one, is that you're sitting and listening to the band the way I would be sitting if I was sitting in front of the band. That's why I've done so much live recording.
Sometimes the Pulitzer Prize for photography goes to the guy who got that shot, and it could be a little grainy, could be a little out of focus, but puts you right there.
Yeah, you want to be there. You want to be there, at the right time, be at the right place in the right time. So anytime I'm involved in a production, that's, I know I have a very good idea I don't know exactly what's going to happen when we get to the studio, but I have a very good idea of it. I know about how musicians that I hire to play, I know how they interact. I know what they sound like. I know what their strengths are, their weaknesses are. And my sessions are very, I think most musicians would tell you that have been with me as a producer, that the sessions go really easily and well, and everybody has a good time, and they all get paid as much as is possible to pay them. I'm really into
Excellent.
Putting money in the guys' pockets, or girls, or whomever.
Let me ask you about the state of music today. That's a loaded question, but the state of the scene, let's say, you've seen so many changes in the industry over your career. What do you see now?
Well, what do you see?
Well, I'm not fishing for anything specific. I'm just thinking you're an educator. There are a lot of young guys coming up. There don't seem to be as many opportunities as there were, or maybe, I don't know. I want your opinion on that. The royalty stream is a mess now with all the streaming, and let's make a more specific topic. You can go to Apple Music for $10 a month and access the history of Western music.
Yeah, but is anybody doing that, or are they just listening to the latest, hip hop single? The students that I work with, they're listening to hip hop. We have them, in our program at William Paterson University. We got them, they're listening to Bud Powell and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Sonny Rollins, and and there will be testing. They come out there with all kinds of arcane knowledge, and the teachers are all, working musicians like me.
Yeah.
I'm not the oldest guy there. Maybe Harold Mayburn is like 5 years older than me. He's still teaching there. And, we give them the authentic, what's on the up and up, and guide them towards, what can we do except recommend what we know worked for us. But, in truth, they have to find out what works for them. They find that any musician who wants to make it today has to figure out how to make it today. Just like I did. My circumstances were maybe there's more work, but it didn't pay as much. And if you got a record date, that was great, but you probably weren't going to see any royalties from it. But the whole thing with what's happening in the music business is it's absurd. The big record companies have all combined, and they basically, as they've probably wanted to do for a long time, just almost cut the musicians out of it. I think that's been a trend for all the years that I've known people in the business. There's only a few that really cared about the musicians. Musicians are the ones who's making their lives possible. But if they could get us out of the equation, they would. And now they seem to have succeeded. So what's next is like, the robots. You've seen those videos of the robots saying, I like the way you played giant steps on your gig, man. But some of my students are doing great. They have their own bands. One of my former students he's in his mid-30s. He's a professor at a prestigious college. He got a MacArthur Genius Grant. He's his own records out, and I see him in the New Yorker and New York Times all the time. Tyshawn Sorey, fantastic musician, composer. Mark Juliana, another one of my guys, is doing great, has his own band, and he recorded the last David Bowie record, and the guys have started their own labels, and people are playing in orchestras or playing jazz, they're writing music, and they're doing much more adept at more things than I ever was. I was just always had an idea what I wanted to do and put myself in position to be able to do that. So, I still recommend that. Like, what do you want to do? Don't ask me what I think you should do. What do you want to do? Like, if I can help you with that, then, I'm good with that. The business, it's always changing, and it's always like, gee, it was better before. I thought that way when I was starting out. Why wasn't I born, so I could have, played with Bird, and, I could have been around in the 30s and 40s. I'm born in 42. And now I have, students that were born in 92, and or 2002, I guess at this point, and they're going like, oh, the old days, 1982. So it's all relative. And say what I'm happy about is that so much of the great stuff of the past is still available. That's the wonderful thing about recordings, and the fact that I've contributed somewhat to that. The availability of really good music, I think, in a very listenable way. I think I'm very happy about that. Maybe that's a bit of a legacy.
Well, it's an excellent legacy, and that's an excellent answer, and it's a very positive answer, and I'm delighted to hear that. And
yeah, I mean, I may have a negative bone in my body, but I try to avoid it. I'm a glass half full guy.
Very obviously. Well, we all appreciate your career and what you've done and what you continue to do. And I'm grateful for you taking the time to be on my show, Bill.
This is a thrill, man. I'm so glad to be asked, Michael. I've been watching some of your shows, and it's really fascinating. I love to see, what people are talking about. And you know how drummers are. We love to get together and talk and, trade whatever. There's no trade secrets or anything, but like, what are you doing with your left hand? And
drummers will tell you too. They love each other.
Well, that's what all my mentors and did for me, and I want to be like they were for me. The Stan Levy, Shelley Mann, Mel Lewis, Freddie Gruber. All these guys were like so important to me and so supportive, and with like little information or the recommendations, gigs, or so I try to continue in that vein.
Well, I'll leave you with a quote from a friend of mine, Don Bennett, who said, "You put two or more drummers in a room, and before long, fun breaks out."
That's a very good quote. I love that.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
All right, Bill. Well, thank you so much, and I hope we talk soon.
I hope so too, Michael. All the best.
Thank you.
Take care.